Hey, how's it going? And welcome back to
Consuming Cinema,
a show about making and pairing food and drinks from popular movies and TV shows. Today, to celebrate the film's 30th anniversary, we're finding out what pairs best with prime rib. Is it a porter or is it absinthe from Bram Stoker's
Dracula?
If you haven't seen Dracula, it's a 1992 Francis Ford Coppola film based on the 1897 novel of the same name by Bram Stoker that follows Jonathan Harker, a solicitor who travels to Transylvania to work for the reclusive Count Dracula, a former impaler and current vampire, who becomes infatuated with Jonathan's fiancée Mina. And the scene we're talking about today features a spectacular-looking roast, likely prime rib, carved up and served to Jonathan and Mina by the one and only part-time doctor/vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing, who sips on a beer that might be a stout but is more likely a porter, while he informs the two that
vampires do exist.
But there's another libation that may actually pair better with prime rib.
Absinthe. The Green Fairy wants your soul.
But before we get to our absinthe, we first have to start our prime rib, which starts with a prime rib roast. Mine is a little over 4-pounder that I got from my local butcher shop. Now you could get a choice rib roast for significantly cheaper, and to hear me talk more about prime versus choice and the different grades of beef, check out our steak sandwich episode you can watch here. The first thing we want to do with this rib roast is pat it completely dry and make sure it's been sitting out at room temperature for at least 6 hours. After which we're going to make an herb compound butter, which is a simple combination of 1 stick of softened unsalted butter, followed by some herbe de Provence, which is a French spice blend that's a mix of lavender, fennel, thyme, and rosemary. And last but not least, some freshly cracked black pepper. Then we're gonna mix this all together before we grab our rib roast, and now we're gonna cover our rib roast in our herb butter. And while I do, I'll mention that this prime rib recipe comes courtesy of the legend himself, Chef John from Food Wishes, whose video you can check out here. So we'll cover this roast in our herb butter, the traditional Chef John way, around the outside, around the outside, around the outside. Then once our roast is completely covered in our herb butter, we're now going to cover it with a generous portion of kosher salt. And it may seem like a lot of salt, but as our prime rib roasts, all of this salt is going to seep through into that meat and create spectacular flavor. Now we're going to put our roast in a cast iron or roasting pan before transferring it to a 500-degree oven for a certain amount of time. And to find out how much time, we're going to grab a handy-dandy calculator.
A calculator.
We're getting a calculator.
And multiply the exact weight of the roast times 5, which will give us the amount of minutes the roast needs to be in the oven at 500 degrees. Then once you reach that time, you want to immediately cut off the heat. Don't open the oven, don't do anything. Don't touch the roast under any circumstances.
Don't touch it!
Right.
Because we're now gonna let that roast sit in the cooling oven for exactly 2 hours. And while it does, we're gonna make a horseradish sauce for our prime rib, which starts in a small bowl, to which we'll add one of my and Randy Marsh's favorite ingredients,
Cream fraiche.
Oh, yeah. Ugh.
and it wouldn't be a horseradish sauce without a few tablespoons of horseradish. I personally like this fresh ground kind as opposed to prepared horseradish, after which we'll add some Dijon mustard, followed by a handful of chopped chives, and finally we'll add some salt and a little bit of white pepper. Then we'll mix this all together before transferring it to the fridge until we're ready to plate. Now we just need to wait for our roast to be done, trying my best not to go completely insane from the amazing smell permeating throughout the apartment.
You haven't thought of the smell, you bitch!
And while this finishes in the oven, I want to mention that this video was requested not just once, but twice by user VanGlorious2020. So comment below which pairing you'd like to see next. Now, once our meat is out of the oven, there's really no need to rest it, as it's basically been resting for 2 hours. But what we will do is cut off this butcher's twine, but before we cut into our prime rib, we're first going to make a jus, which we'll do on the stove to go along with it, and mix in about a tablespoon of flour in addition to some beef stock, which I realized I should have gotten a low sodium variety of, as I used quite a bit of salt on this prime rib. The next thing we want to do is remove the bones from the bottom of the prime rib, which is very easy to do by just following along the bones with a knife, and then you can separate those two bones and gnaw on a delicious little appetizer with a loved one, like I did with Bailey here. After that little snack, it's time to carve our prime rib. So we'll carve a few slices of our beautiful prime rib, which should be a lovely medium rare. Then we'll plate our prime rib on a platter like so, after which we'll grab both our horseradish sauce as well as that jus. Now it's time to talk about absinthe, which, if you don't know, is a spirit made from a blend of wormwood, anise, and fennel that tastes a lot like licorice. I chose the brand Lucid as they use traditional French methods at their nearly 200-year-old Combier distillery designed by Gustave Eiffel. Yes, that Eiffel. To prepare our absinthe, we will need an absinthe spoon, which is slotted, and I'll explain why in a second. We'll also need an absinthe glass. Now this actually isn't an absinthe glass, but rather an Irish coffee glass, which does closely resemble a real absinthe glass. And we'll use these tools to perform the traditional absinthe ritual involving a sugar cube. So first we'll pour 2 ounces of absinthe into our glass, and then we'll set the absinthe spoon atop the glass like so. But before we finish our absinthe, you know what I feel like?
Mother effing beer.
For our porter, I'm going to be using the Taddy Porter from Samuel Smith, one of England's oldest breweries, which uses well water from its original well sunk in 1758. So we'll pour our porter into a chilled pint glass, and at long last, our prime rib is finally done. Now it's time to figure out what pairs best. Will it be absinthe or will it be a porter? First, we're going to take a bite of this spectacular looking prime rib, and man, oh man, that meat is so succulent and tender, it quite literally melts in your mouth. And it's made even better when dipped in that decadent salty jus, not to mention that silky, creamy, spicy horseradish. Even the more well done outer ring is still remarkably tender. And if you wanted to eliminate this ring, you could always reverse sear this roast as we did in our aforementioned steak sandwich video. That said, this is truly the best prime rib I have ever had. It's absolutely phenomenal. But how does our prime rib pair with absinthe and porter? Well, we'll start with the porter as it's beginning to lose its frothy head. And what's great about the way this porter pairs with prime rib is because while porters have that chocolatey, coffee-like flavor profile of a stout, they're significantly lighter, crisper, and more drinkable. And this savory, salty meat is wonderfully complemented by this cold, refreshing beer, quite similar to our last episode you can watch here. I'm quite honestly a little bit surprised at just how good this porter pairs with prime rib, but we still have to see how the absinthe compares. So we'll finish the absinthe ritual by placing a sugar cube atop our absinthe spoon, and we'll also need a glass of ice water, as well as this turkey baster, which I'm using in place of one of the elaborate and costly absinthe fountains, used to drip ice water atop the sugar cube and absinthe spoon like so. And as we drip the ice water over the sugar cube, we'll notice the absinthe in the glass turn into a milky, opaque color. This effect is called the louche. The louche occurs because the spirit contains components that are not water soluble, such as the fennel and anise. Thus, a more pronounced louche is indicative of a higher quality, more natural absinthe. And once the sugar cube is mostly dissolved, we'll use the absinthe spoon to further mix the cocktail before briefly examining the quality of the Lucid's louche and giving it a sip. And right off the bat, I think the absinthe is the winner here. It's licorice forward, but with a nice sweetness from the sugar, and the absinthe's anise and fennel notes wonderfully pair with the fennel from the herb de Provence. The way the aromatic sweetness from the absinthe complements the savory beef is reminiscent of red wine, which is interesting considering that by 1910, the French were drinking 36 million liters of absinthe a year, which put such a dent in the French wine industry that their Winemakers Association began a disinformation campaign falsely accusing absinthe of causing hallucinations, insanity, and criminal activity. So while the porter pairs pretty darn well with the prime rib, I'd probably give it about a 1.5 or 1.75 thumbs up, but without a doubt, that absinthe paired with this prime rib is most definitely worthy of 2 big thumbs up. If you like the channel, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Please leave any video suggestions in the comments below so that your idea could end up on the next video like this one. Full recipes will be included in a link in the video description. Follow us on all forms of social media at Consuming Cinema, and don't forget to join us next week for the first part of a 2-part episode when we make a pairing from The Holiday. And as always, thank you for watching.